What if I told you that the fastest growing fear in the world isn't about climate change or robots or even war? It's about a religion. A religion followed by nearly 2 billion people. And the shocking part, most of the people who fear it don't even understand it. That fear has a name: Islamophobia. Now pause for a second. Imagine this: you walk into a room, and before you even speak, people already decided who you are. Not because of your personality, not because of your choices, but because of a label attached to you. How would that feel? That's the silent weight millions of Muslims carry every day. But here's the real mystery: why is Islamophobia rising now? Think about the last time you saw Muslims in a movie, TV show, or news headline. Chances are it was tied to violence, extremism, or fear. Over time, those images stack up. People begin to connect Muslim with danger, even if they've never met one in their life. Fear sells. Fear wins votes. Some leaders know that if they point to threat, they can rally people behind them. Muslims often become the convenient target. Most people simply don't know any Muslims personally. And when you don't know someone, it's easy to believe the stereotypes. It's like judging a book not by its cover, but by someone else's rumor about the cover. Here's the secret: Islamophobia isn't just a Muslim problem, it's a human problem. Because the same system that paints Muslims as dangerous today could paint another group tomorrow. Fighting Islamophobia protects everyone. Let me tell you a story. A young Muslim girl walks into her classroom wearing a headscarf. She braces herself for the stares. But that day, something different happens. A non-Muslim classmate sits beside her and says, "I like your scarf." Small words, huge impact. That one act transformed her entire week. And that's the point. Fighting Islamophobia doesn't always mean speeches or protests. Sometimes it's as simple as sitting beside someone who feels alone. So let me leave you with this: the rise of Islamophobia is real. It's fueled by media, politics, and ignorance. But the response is in our hands. You don't have to be Muslim to fight Islamophobia. You just have to be human. And remember, when you choose education over ignorance, courage over silence, and unity over division, you don't just change someone's day. You change the world's future. So tonight, you're not just an audience, you're part of a movement that says fear will not define us. Humanity will. Welcome to the front line of change. Islamophobia is rising due to media bias, political fear, mongering, and ignorance. Media often portrays Muslims negatively, reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Politicians use fear of Muslims to gain power and control. Lack of personal interaction with Muslims fuels misunderstanding and prejudice. Responding requires education, courage to speak up, and unity across communities. Fighting Islamophobia isn't just about Muslims. It's about protecting human dignity for all. Imagine turning on the television late at night. The screen flashes with breaking news. The red banner screams words like attack, terror, suspect. And then, almost like a script you've seen 100 times, the camera pans to a name or a face that is Muslim. You don't need to wait for the rest of the story, because you've already seen this storyline before. It's familiar. It's repeated so often that it feels predictable. But here's the problems. Predictability shapes perception. If the only time a religion appears in mainstream media is in the context of violence, the human brain begins to make a dangerous shortcut: Muslim equals threat. It doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle, almost invisible. The same way a single drop of water seems harmless, but over years can carve valleys through stone. Each headline, each movie, each television series that portrays Muslims as villains is another drop. One drop is forgettable. 10 drops make a puddle. Thousands create a flood of fear that seeps into our collective imagination. Think about Hollywood movies for a moment. Who plays the terrorist in most action films? Who is the shadowy figure plotting in a desert bunker or shouting in a foreign language before an explosion? When was the last time you saw a Muslim character portrayed as simply a doctor saving lives, a teacher inspiring kids, a parent tucking their children into bed. The camera rarely tells that story. And when it does, it often feels like an exception rather than the rule. There was a study done on popular television shows, and it revealed that Muslims were disproportionately depicted as dangerous or suspicious. In one analysis, more than 2/3 of Muslim characters on US television were tied to terrorism storylines. Imagine that for a second, 2/3. If that's the picture you're exposed to, and you don't personally know any Muslims, then the fiction becomes your reality. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a young boy, about 8 years old, living in a small town. He's never met a Muslim in real life. His family doesn't have Muslim friends. His school doesn't talk about world religions beyond a few paragraphs in a dusty textbook. But every night, he watches TV with his parents. On the news, Muslims are linked to war. In action movies, Muslims are the villains. In comedies, Muslims are the punchline. Slowly, without realizing it, his mind builds an association. Muslim means enemy. So one day, when he meets a Muslim classmate for the first time, he's already carrying a story about them that he didn't choose, but one that the media wrote for him. This isn't just about children. Adults are just as vulnerable. There's a phrase used in psychology called availability heuristic. It means that when we try to judge how likely something is, we rely on examples that come easily to mind. If the examples you've seen of Muslims are all tied to violence, then violence feels like the truth. Even if statistics prove otherwise, the emotional images win. You may know, logically, that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. But if your imagination has been fed a steady diet of explosions and angry faces, logic doesn't stand a chance. I once heard someone say, if it bleeds, it leads. That's how newsrooms often decide what deserves airtime. Stories that shock, scare, or alarm us get pushed to the top, and nothing shocks quite like terrorism. But what gets left out are the countless quiet, ordinary, positive stories of Muslims living, working, and contributing. Those don't make headlines, they don't bring ratings, and so they vanish into silence. The result? A skewed reality, a mirror that only reflects the darkest shadows while ignoring the light. Let's make it even more personal. Picture a Muslim father in America. He wakes up, makes breakfast for his kids, drives them to school, and heads to work. On the way, he turns on the radio and hears commentators debating the Muslim threat. He shakes his head and keeps driving. Later that day, his daughter comes home crying because a classmate asked her if her dad was a terrorist. That child didn't come up with the idea on her own. She borrowed it from a screen. The media gave her the script, and she simply repeated it. Do you see how the cycle works? And here's the cruel irony. The more Muslims are depicted as outsiders, the harder it becomes for people to actually see them as neighbors, colleagues, or friends. It creates distance. That distance breeds suspicion. And suspicion, when fueled long enough, erupts into prejudice, discrimination, even violence. A headline is never just a headline. A scene in a movie is never just fiction. These things stack, they accumulate, they weave into the fabric of how a society thinks. Now let me tell you about a woman I once met at a community dialogue. She admitted with tears in her eyes that for years she was afraid of Muslims. Not because she had ever been harmed by one, not because she had ever even spoken to one, but because the only images she saw were frightening. Every time I heard the word Muslim, I thought of bombs and shouting men on TV, she confessed. But then, something shifted. She met a Muslim family who lived down the street. They invited her over for dinner one evening. She walked into their home nervously, half expecting the stereotypes to come alive. Instead, she found laughter, kindness, and a plate of warm food. She told me later, that night destroyed 20 years of fear. Think about that. 20 years of programming undone by a single meal. That's the power of real human connection. But it also reveals the power of media narratives. 2 decades of fear built entirely out of images on a screen. There's also another layer we rarely talk about. When Muslims themselves see these portrayals, it's not just hurtful, it's exhausting. Imagine waking up every day knowing that before you even open your mouth, someone might already suspect you. Imagine feeling like you have to work twice as hard just to prove you're normal. That weight doesn't disappear when the credits roll. It lingers in the workplace, at airports, in classrooms. It shapes self-esteem, mental health, even career opportunities. The late scholar Edward Said once called this phenomena Orientalism, the idea that the West often portrays the East as exotic, dangerous, and inferior in order to define itself as superior. You can see echoes of that idea every time a news channel uses desert backdrops and ominous music when talking about Muslims. These choices aren't neutral, they tell a story, and over time, that story becomes the default lens through which millions of people view nearly a quarter of the world's population. So when we ask, why is Islamophobia rising? We cannot ignore the role of media. Because media is not just a mirror, it's also a magnifying glass. It doesn't just reflect reality, it enlarges certain pieces of it, sometimes to the point of distortion. And when that distortion is repeated enough, it feels like truth. Picture a crowded rally on a hot summer afternoon. The air hums with chants and applause. A politician steps up to the microphone, wipes the sweat from his brow, and leans forward with a knowing smile. My friends, he begins, there is a threat among us, a danger that wants to destroy our way of life. But don't worry, I will protect you. The crowd erupts. No one asks for proof. No one asks for nuance, because fear doesn't need evidence. Fear just needs a target. And in this moment, the target is Muslims. Politics has always had a strange relationship with fear. Throughout history, leaders have discovered that when people are scared, they're easier to control. A frightened society doesn't ask hard questions. A frightened society doesn't debate policy details. It simply clings to whoever promises safety. And nothing fuels fear more effectively than pointing to an other, someone who looks different, prays differently, or comes from another land. Muslims have become the convenient other in this era. Think back to the years after 9/11. Entire governments shifted their rhetoric. Suddenly, words like terrorism and Islam were uttered in the same breath, almost as if they were synonyms. Politicians stood on podiums and declared wars not just on individuals who committed crimes, but on entire regions, entire cultures, entire faiths by implication. Overnight, an entire religion became political currency. Fear was no longer just an emotion, it was a campaign strategy. Consider how election seasons play out. When unemployment rises, when healthcare falters, when the economy wobbles, leaders know the public is angry. Instead of facing blame, many cleverly redirect that anger. They whisper, it's not our policies failing you, it's them. It's the outsiders, it's the Muslims. And the whisper becomes a roar. Political ads show grainy footage of men shouting in foreign languages, desert backdrops, ominous music. The unspoken message, vote for me, or they will come for you. It's theater, but it's effective. I once met a young man who worked on a political campaign. He admitted something chilling. He said, whenever our poll numbers dipped, we'd test new ads about immigration or terrorism. Those numbers always shot back up. Fear worked better than hope. That confession reveals the game. Islamophobia isn't an accident. It's a strategy. It's manipulated, packaged, and sold like a product because fear is profitable at the ballot box. Let's zoom out for a moment. This isn't unique to one country. Across the world, politicians have discovered the same trick. In Europe, far-right parties climb in popularity by warning of a Muslim invasion. They point to refugees fleeing war and paint them as threats, not victims. In Asia, certain governments frame Muslim minorities as disloyal outsiders, stirring suspicion to consolidate power. In America, leaders have spoken of Muslim bans, creating policies that treat faith itself as a crime. Different nations, different accents, but the same script win power by selling fear of Muslims. Now, imagine the human side of this. A Muslim family sitting in their living room, watching the evening news, they see a candidate on screen talking about Muslims as if they are a disease, something to be contained. The father shifts uncomfortably in his chair. The mother sighs, her heart heavy. The children look at their parents with questions in their eyes. Why do they hate us? How do you explain to a child that their identity has been turned into a political talking point, that their existence has been reduced to a strategy? It reminds me of a story told by a Muslim mother in the Midwest. She said her son came home from school one day and asked, "Mom, will we be sent away if that man becomes president?" He was only 10 years old. 10, he didn't understand polling or speeches or campaign slogans. But he understood fear. He understood that someone powerful was saying people like him didn't belong. And he carried that weight into his childhood, a childhood that should have been about soccer games and birthday parties, not deportation. This is the ripple effect of political fear, mongering. It doesn't just shape policy. It shapes playgrounds, classrooms, workplaces. It trickles down into the way neighbors look at each other, the way co-workers whisper, the way strangers treat one another at airports. It transforms suspicion into social currency, giving ordinary people permission to act on prejudices they might have once kept hidden. Because if a leader can say it on stage, then surely it must be okay to repeat it at the dinner table, right? That's the unspoken permission slip politics hands to society. And the irony is this: the very leaders who stoke Islamophobia often know Muslims personally. They've dined with them, negotiated with them, accepted their campaign donations. But in public, they perform. They perform fear because it wins attention. They perform division because it rallies the base. It's not about truth, it's about leverage. And in the process, ordinary Muslims, families, workers, students, become collateral damage in a political game they never chose to play. Consider the quote from Joseph Goebbels, the infamous Nazi propagandist. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Replace lie with fear, and you have a perfect description of modern politics. The lie today is that Muslims are inherently dangerous, incapable of coexisting, forever outsiders. Repeat it enough, in debates, in rallies, in ads, and it starts to feel like truth, even if every personal experience someone has with a Muslim contradicts it. But here's the tragedy within the tragedy. When fear becomes the glue that holds a political movement together, it poisons everything else. Real issues, education, healthcare, poverty, jobs, get buried under the noise of scapegoating. Energy that could be spent building solutions is wasted tearing down communities. And society as a whole suffers. Because in the end, Islamophobia doesn't just hurt Muslims. It distracts everyone from progress. Now imagine the silence in the moments after a political rally ends. The crowd disperses. The stage lights dim. The politician retreats to a quiet room, already planning the next speech. To them, those words were just strategy, a line in a campaign, a way to climb higher. But out there, beyond the stage, the echo of those words lingers. A Muslim teenager walks down the street that night and feels eyes on him. A Muslim woman hesitates before wearing her headscarf to work the next day. A mosque receives a threatening letter. The strategy may win votes, but the cost is paid in fear, in anxiety, in broken trust between neighbors. It's tempting to think politics is a distant arena, a show that plays out on television screens, while ordinary life goes on untouched. But when politicians choose Muslims as their scapegoat, ordinary life is exactly what gets disrupted. It's not just about speeches in parliament halls or debates on campaign trails. It's about the Muslim taxi driver who wonders if his passenger is silently judging him. It's about the student who questions whether their teacher sees them as a learner or as a suspect. It's about the grandmother at the grocery store who lowers her voice when speaking Arabic to her granddaughter, afraid of the stairs. That's where the real cost of political fear, mongering, is felt, in the small, private corners of everyday life. And yet, the game continues. Because as long as fear keeps winning elections, politicians will keep playing it. They'll keep opening the same wound, pouring salt into it, and pointing to the pain as proof of their prophecy. See? They'll say, "We were right to warn you." It's a self-fulfilling cycle, designed not to solve problems but to sustain power. And until people recognize the trick for what it is, a performance, a manipulation, the cycle remains unbroken. Imagine walking into a room filled with strangers. No one knows you, but every set of eyes is already writing your story. Not because of what you've said, not because of what you've done, but because of a rumor they all heard before you even walked through the door. That is what ignorance feels like. It's not just an absence of knowledge, it's a presence of assumption. And when it comes to Muslims, ignorance has become one of the strongest fuels for Islamophobia. Think about the average person in a small town who has never met a Muslim in their life. Their community is tight, knit, familiar, predictable. They know the shopkeepers, the teachers, the church pastor. They share holidays, local gossip, sports rivalries. But Muslims, they're just a word, a headline, a distant idea. So when the only exposure comes from news reports of bombings or TV dramas with villains shouting in Arabic, what fills that void of real experience? Stereotypes, half-truths, shadows mistaken for reality. There's a young woman I once spoke with who grew up in a rural area. She admitted that before college, she thought Muslims were oppressed women and angry men. That was the image she had pieced together from television. She'd never actually spoken to a Muslim, not once. When she met her first Muslim roommate in college, she was surprised. She was funny, she said, almost sheepishly, as if humor was some extraordinary trait. She liked the same music as me. She binge-watched the same shows. She was just normal. The ignorance didn't make her cruel, it simply made her blind. And blindness, when left unchallenged, becomes prejudice. Ignorance is like fog. It blurs the edges of what we see, making shapes look more menacing than they are. A shadow in the fog could be a tree, or it could be a monster. And when people are surrounded by fog long enough, they stop trusting their own eyes and start believing the stories others tell them. "Don't go near that shadow," someone whispers. And the whisper spreads until no one remembers if the danger was real or just imagined. That's what happens when ignorance about Muslims grows unchecked. It doesn't just create confusion, it creates fear. One teacher once shared a story of her students. In a classroom of 15-year-olds, she asked what they thought of when they heard the word Muslim. Hands shot up. Terrorist, violence, oppressed women. Not one student mentioned kindness, family, prayer, community, art, or science, all of which are integral to Muslim life. And why? Because none of them had ever actually met a Muslim person. Their entire understanding was secondhand, pieced together from headlines and half-remembered TV shows. Imagine how different that classroom conversation might have been if just one Muslim classmate had been there to share their real life. The most insidious thing about ignorance is that it convinces people they already know enough. That's why it's dangerous. People don't walk around saying, "I am ignorant about Muslims." Instead, they say, "I know what they're like." They'll point to something they read online or saw in a documentary. They'll repeat a story someone told them about a cousin's neighbor's coworker. They'll speak with confidence about a religion they've never studied, a culture they've never experienced, a person they've never spoken to. And confidence built on ignorance is far harder to dismantle than silence. I remember a story from a man who wore a beard and a kufi cap, traditional in many Muslim communities. He said he noticed people often avoided sitting next to him on the train, day after day. He'd have an empty seat beside him while the rest of the car filled up. One day, an older woman finally asked why he dressed the way he did. He explained. He shared that it was part of his faith, part of his identity. Her response was startling in its honesty. "I thought only extremists dressed like that." She wasn't malicious. just uninformed. But that ignorance had kept her from ever considering him as simply another commuter on his way to work. Ignorance doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It's in the awkward silence when someone hears an unfamiliar name. It's in the way people stumble over whether to say Muslim or Islamic because they've never bothered to learn the difference. It's in the questions asked with suspicion. Where are you really from? Or do women have rights in your religion? Questions that reveal more about the asker's gaps in knowledge than about the person they're asking. And yet, when ignorance is shattered, the effect can be transformative. There was a program in one city called Meet a Muslim. Volunteers would sit in public spaces with a sign that simply said, "Ask me anything." People approached cautiously at first. They asked awkward, sometimes offensive questions. Do you hate America? Are you forced to marry? But the Muslims answered patiently, with honesty and warmth. Slowly, people's faces softened. One woman who had been terrified of Muslims confessed after her conversation, "I never realized how much I didn't know. I feel embarrassed." But she also felt freed from the fog of ignorance she had been living in for years. The tragedy is that ignorance is often preventable. It's the easiest thing in the world to cure. Just spend time with people, listen to them, share stories, eat meals together. But instead of reaching out, society often retreats. Neighborhoods stay segregated. Schools remain homogeneous. People cling to their circles and let media fill the gaps. And so ignorance breeds, not because people are incapable of learning, but because they never step outside the bubbles they build around themselves. A Muslim scholar once said, "People fear what they do not know. And when they fear, they hate." That chain reaction begins with ignorance. It begins with never having a real conversation. It begins with believing the rumor instead of meeting the person. And once fear sets in, it is much harder to undo. That is why ignorance is not just harmless unawareness, it is the seed from which Islamophobia grows. Sometimes I think of ignorance as a locked door. Behind the door lies understanding, friendship, empathy. But most people never try the handle. They stand in front of the door and imagine what could be inside. Some imagine monsters, some imagine chaos. Few imagine warmth. And because they never open it, they live in fear of a room that was never threatening to begin with. But the key has always been there. Curiosity, conversation, courage. Picture a dark room. You can't see what's in front of you. The shadows feel alive, and every creak in the floor makes your chest tighten. That is what ignorance does. It turns the unknown into something terrifying. But now imagine someone switches on the light. Suddenly, the shadows are just chairs, a table, a lamp. The fear dissolves, not because the room changed, but because you can finally see. That is what education does to Islamophobia. The simplest truth is this: people rarely hate what they truly understand. When a person learns about a religion, a culture, or a history that was once foreign to them, the mystery loses its power. Ignorance shrinks and empathy has room to grow. That is why education is more than classrooms and textbooks. It is the act of turning on the light. Think about the first time you learned something that completely shattered a stereotype you held. Maybe you discovered that the quiet student in class was a talented musician, or that the grumpy neighbor next door was caring for a sick spouse. In an instant, the story in your head changed because knowledge replaced assumption. The same shift happens when people take the time to learn about Islam and Muslims. The stereotype of violence and oppression doesn't survive when faced with facts about art, science, philosophy, and centuries of contributions that shaped the world. I once met a teacher who decided to dedicate an entire week of her history class to Muslim civilization. She taught her students about algebra, astronomy, poetry, and architecture that came out of the Islamic Golden Age. By the end of the week, one student raised his hand and said, "I didn't know Muslims invented so much. I thought they were just terrorists." The boy wasn't cruel. He was simply uneducated. With just a week of lessons, his entire perspective began to shift. That is the quiet revolution of knowledge. But education doesn't only come from books. It comes from conversations. It comes from curiosity. I remember a story of a college program called Dinner with a Muslim. Families opened their homes to strangers, inviting them to share a meal and ask anything they wanted. Some questions were blunt, even uncomfortable. Why do women wear hijab? Do Muslims hate Christians? But by the end of each dinner, laughter filled the room. People realized how much they had in common: love for children, pride in heritage, hope for the future. One guest said afterward, "I came with questions, but I left with friends." That kind of education can't be found in a textbook. Education also has a ripple effect. A single informed person can influence dozens around them. Take the example of a man who once confessed that he had made cruel jokes about Muslims at work. But then his company invited a speaker to give a talk on Islamophobia. The speaker shared stories of real Muslim families in the community, their struggles and resilience. The man admitted, "I had never thought of them as people with lives like mine." After that day, he stopped making jokes. More than that, he began challenging his co-workers when they made comments. One talk, 1 hour of education, and the ripple spread through an entire workplace. There is also something profoundly healing for Muslims when education enters the conversation. When someone asks with genuine curiosity instead of suspicion, it transforms the interaction. A Muslim woman once shared that when a colleague asked her respectfully why she wore the hijab, it was the first time she felt seen instead of judged. She said, "It felt like someone wanted to know me, not just label me." Education doesn't only change minds, it restores dignity. Of course, education requires humility. It requires admitting, "I don't know." And that can be uncomfortable in a world where people want to appear confident, even when they're misinformed. But humility is the door to truth. When someone chooses to ask, to listen, to learn, they are essentially saying, "Your story matters more than my assumption." That act alone is powerful. And perhaps the most beautiful part of education is how simple it can be. It doesn't always need lectures or programs. Sometimes it's as easy as sharing a cup of tea with a neighbor, visiting a mosque during an open house, reading a book written by a Muslim author, or even watching a documentary that shows real Muslim lives instead of caricatures. Each step chips away at the wall of ignorance, brick by brick. Education is not about memorizing facts, it's about humanizing faces. It's about breaking the illusion that Muslims are strangers and seeing instead that they are classmates, co-workers, doctors, parents, artists, dreamers. And once that recognition happens, fear loses its grip, because it is hard to fear someone you have taken the time to truly know. There is a moment we all recognize, though we rarely admit it. A moment when someone says something cruel or ignorant or unfair and the room goes silent. Everyone hears it. Everyone feels the weight of it. And yet no one speaks. Why? Because silence feels safer. Speaking up feels risky. But it's in that very moment, those few seconds of hesitation, that courage has the chance to change everything. Courage in the face of Islamophobia isn't always grand or dramatic. It often happens in small, almost invisible ways. A teenager in a classroom hears a classmate joke about Muslims being terrorists. She feels her heart racing, her palms sweating. She knows if she says something, the joke might turn on her. But she raises her hand anyway and says, "That's not funny. My neighbor's Muslim, and she's nothing like that." The room shifts. The laughter fades. The silence feels different now, heavier, but also hopeful. That small act of courage cracked the surface of ignorance. Think about what silence does. Silence is an endorsement, even if we don't mean it to be. When a slur goes unchallenged, when a stereotype is left hanging in the air, it gains strength, it takes root. People think, if no one objects, maybe it's true. That's why courage matters so deeply. Courage interrupts the pattern. It breaks the script. It says, "No, that is not okay." And when one person has the courage to speak, others find theirs too. There was once a story of a Muslim man who owned a small grocery store. He often faced whispers and stares from certain customers. One afternoon, a man walked in and muttered a slur under his breath. The store fell quiet. But then something unexpected happened. An older woman who had shopped there for years spoke up. "Don't you talk to him like that. He's part of this neighborhood. He's been feeding us for decades." Her voice was firm, her eyes unflinching. The aggressor left in silence. The Muslim grocer said later, "That one act of courage made me feel like I belonged." It wasn't a rally, it wasn't a protest. It was one voice, strong enough to push back against hate. Courage doesn't erase fear. In fact, courage can only exist when fear is present. It is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. A young Muslim student once shared how she trembled before giving a presentation in class about her faith. She knew she might be mocked. She knew some would roll their eyes. But she did it anyway. She explained why she wore the hijab, what her daily prayers meant to her, what Ramadan felt like. When she finished, the class applauded. One student came up afterward and said, "I never understood any of this before. Thank you." Her courage turned a room of potential judgment into a room of learning. There's something contagious about courage. When one person shows it, others borrow it. A workplace diversity meeting becomes tense when someone suggests Muslims don't belong in leadership positions. For a moment, no one responds. But then a colleague clears his throat and says firmly, "That's not true. Our team wouldn't function without Amina's leadership." That one defense empowers others to add their voices. Soon the tide turns, not because everyone was brave at once, but because one person dared to break the silence. And sometimes courage looks like consistency. Not one dramatic stand, but dozens of small ones. A teacher consistently correcting stereotypes in the classroom. A neighbor consistently inviting a Muslim family to community events. A coworker consistently pushing back when casual Islamophobic comments surface. Each small act on its own may seem like a drop in the ocean, but together they create waves. It's important to remember that courage is not reserved for activists or leaders. It belongs to ordinary people in ordinary moments. The mother who defends a Muslim parent at a PTA meeting. The teenager who refuses to laugh at a cruel joke. The employee who challenges bias during a staff meeting. These are the hidden acts of bravery that shape the culture around us. One man once said, "I'm not brave enough to change the world." But he didn't realize he already had. At a cafe, he saw a Muslim woman being harassed. People stared, but no one moved. He walked over, sat beside her, and asked about her day. He talked to her about the weather, about books, about coffee. The harasser grew frustrated and left. Later, the woman said, "You saved me without even raising your voice." That's the thing about courage. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as gentle as a conversation. And if we look closely, we realize courage is not optional in the fight against Islamophobia. It is the difference between prejudice thriving in the shadows and prejudice being dragged into the light. It is the choice to be uncomfortable for a moment so that others don't have to live in fear for a lifetime. It is the willingness to risk a little bit of awkwardness to preserve someone else's dignity. Courage doesn't make us superheroes. It makes us human in the most powerful sense. There is something powerful that happens when people realize their struggles are tied together. At first, it may not seem obvious. A Muslim family facing discrimination at work, a Jewish family hearing slurs on the street, a black teenager pulled over unfairly, an immigrant couple struggling to be accepted in their new neighborhood. Different experiences, different faces, but the root is the same: prejudice that feeds on division. And when those groups stand apart, the prejudice feels bigger, stronger, harder to fight. But when they stand together, it changes everything. Unity doesn't just add voices, it multiplies their power. I remember hearing about a small town where a mosque was vandalized overnight. Windows shattered, graffiti scrawled across the walls. The next morning, Muslims arrived heartbroken, ready to clean up the damage quietly. But what they saw instead stunned them. Their neighbors were already there: Christians, Jews, atheists, teachers, shopkeepers. Buckets in hand, brushes ready. One local priest held a sign that read, "Your mosque is our church too." The cleanup became more than repairs. It became a declaration. Hatred had tried to isolate one group, but unity had turned it into a community's battle. That's the secret prejudice doesn't expect, that its power shrinks when unity rises. Unity is not about erasing differences. It's about recognizing that our differences make us stronger when woven together. Like threads in a tapestry, each color and texture adds beauty, but only if they intertwine. Left separate, they are fragile. Together, they are unbreakable. That's why Islamophobia cannot be fought by Muslims alone, because the system that allows fear to flourish against Muslims today can just as easily be turned on someone else tomorrow. Unity is both defense and prevention. A Muslim student once shared a story about her high school. She had been bullied for wearing a hijab, pushed in the hallway, called names. For weeks she walked alone, keeping her head down. Then one day, something shifted. A group of non-Muslim classmates decided to walk with her between classes. They didn't make speeches. They didn't fight back with insults. They simply surrounded her with presence. Suddenly, the bullies stopped. The cruelty ended, not because she fought back alone, but because others stood beside her. That is what unity looks like in its simplest form: ordinary people choosing not to let someone stand alone. There's a phrase often repeated in social justice movements: an injury to one is an injury to all. At first, it sounds like a slogan. But when you watch how prejudice spreads, it becomes a warning. History shows that hatred rarely stays confined to one group. In one decade, it might target Jews. In another, immigrants. In another, Muslims. The labels change, but the machinery of hate stays the same. Unity is the recognition that by defending each other, we are really defending ourselves. Consider what happened after the Christchurch mosque attack in New Zealand. The horror shook the world. But what followed was just as unforgettable. Thousands of non-Muslims formed circles of protection around mosques, holding hands, standing guard during Friday prayers. Some women even wore headscarves in solidarity. The message was loud and clear: you are not alone. Unity transformed grief into resilience. It showed that when hatred tries to tear a hole in the fabric of society, people can sew it back stronger than before. And unity does not always require big moments. It often lives in small acts of everyday solidarity. A teacher who insists on including Muslim holidays in the school calendar. A neighbor who makes sure the Muslim family down the street feels welcome during community events. A coworker who learns how to pronounce their colleague's Arabic name correctly, refusing to let it be twisted into a joke. These gestures may seem small, but to the person receiving them, they echo loudly. They whisper, "You belong. We see you." Unity also requires listening, truly listening. Not rushing to compare struggles or prove whose pain is greater, but sitting with each other's stories until they become part of our own. A black activist once told a Muslim friend, "Your fight is my fight too," because the same system that looks at me as a threat looks at you the same way. That kind of recognition builds bridges that are not easily broken. It creates alliances strong enough to outlast political cycles, strong enough to outshine media distortions. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about unity is that it doesn't just shield the vulnerable, it transforms the bystanders too. People who once felt powerless discover their voice when they join others. A man who never thought of himself as an activist suddenly finds himself marching. A woman who never imagined confronting prejudice hears herself speaking up. Unity pulls courage out of people who didn't know they had it. It shows them that change is not the job of a few, but the responsibility of all. What we face is not just a rise in Islamophobia. What we face is a test of whether we will stay silent or whether we will rise. A test of whether fear will divide us or whether courage will unite us. a test of whether history will remember us as bystanders or as people who stood when standing was hard. And the truth is, every single one of us has a choice. We can choose silence, or we can choose to speak. We can choose to look away, or we can choose to stand beside those who are targeted. We can choose fear, or we can choose courage. Again and again, hatred will try to whisper that nothing can change, but unity answers louder. Again and again, fear will try to tell us we are too small to matter, but courage answers stronger. Again and again, division will try to convince us that this is not our fight, but truth answers clearer. It is all of our fight. The time is not tomorrow. The time is not someday. The time is now. To act, to speak, to stand, to protect, to heal. Because Islamophobia is not just a Muslim problem. It is a human problem. And when we fight it, we are not just defending one faith, we are defending humanity itself. So I leave you with this truth: silence keeps the cycle alive, but courage breaks it. Division feeds hate, but unity starves it. And one voice, your voice, can be the spark that changes the story. The question is not whether change is possible. The question is whether we will be brave enough to begin. And if we begin together, let me tell you this: hate doesn't stand a chance.